Welcome to All Things Non-Linear Dynamical, talks about the brain and human connection. My name's Andrew Edwards, a radio broadcaster for 30 plus years with the BBC in the UK and a previous guest on this fabulous podcast. Craig wants me to introduce myself as the magnificent bearded broadcaster, generously and masterfully offering the show intros from across the Atlantic, but I'm much too modest to say any of that. This show tackles the big questions, overcoming challenges, mental well-being, the power of music and literature, and even cutting-edge brain training tech. Join Craig de Servidor and his special and amazing guests as they explore the physical and mental landscapes that make us who we are, offering practical tools and broad perspectives to help you navigate your own unique journey. It's going to get weird, it's going to get wonderful, so buckle up and get ready to explore the incredible world within. Today, in our extra special episode, we are beyond delighted to be talking with Dr. Traci Stein. And just a fair warning to buckle up, buttercups, because we're getting entangled. Now, exactly what does this mean, you say? Have you ever felt a connection with someone so strong it felt like you were sharing the same brain, like you could finish each other's sentences, or worse, finish each other's burritos? So fasten your seatbelts and make sure those seatbelts are properly buckled, because today we're diving into the science behind these spooky connections, the physics of feelings, the quantum mechanics of maybe soulmates and kindred spirits. That's right, folks. We're talking about spooky action at a distance, quantum entanglement, and the wild ways our lives can become intertwined. As I said, it's going to get weird, it's going to get wonderful, and it's going to be led by the amazing Dr. Traci Stein. But before we meet Traci, let's untangle a little bit about her. Dr. Traci is a force of nature, a Columbia-trained psychologist, a certified hypnotherapist, an award-winning author, and the mastermind behind a whole series of guided imagery and meditations to help you unlock your inner potential. From busting bad habits to manifesting your dream life, Traci's got the audio tools to help you get there. And guess what? She's also a master of intuition, weaving science and spirit together like a cosmic tapestry. Traci's new podcast, Unpacking Possibility, is all about the journeys of amazing people who've tapped into their intuition and achieved incredible things. So today on this podcast, we're getting entangled with Traci. We're going to explore the unseen threads that connect us, the spooky distances our feelings can travel, and how these connections can transform us both inside and out. So, are you ready to explore the quantum leap of human connection? Then get ready to be curious. Off to our show host, ladies and gentlemen, Craig de Servidor, to get this party properly started.
Oh, how can I follow Andrew, Traci?
How could I?
Well, we're going to do our best here. It's so wonderful to have you. Thank you so very much.
No, thank you for having me.
Oh, you're quite welcome.
I hope I can live up to like 10% of that intro.
Well, hey,
Let's
so
see.
I think you shall, and we'll
Let's
go
see what we
with
manifest.
it. We're running with it, but it's just I'm tickled pink to have you here. I mean, I've been following you. I like to do a how we met. I found you through Health Journeys and Bell Ruth Napperstuck's company, and it was around 2012. And you had this guided imetry masterpiece, I like to call it, because I needed help with this at the time. Procrastination. Let's get going. Come on, we got to get this project. And I no longer need that. So there's your testimonial. Yay. Because it was just so wonderful. And and I just kind of followed you like a puppy dog. I mean, we know Bell Ruth has for me, she had a magnificent voice and cadence, and it was, difficult for me to find something similar. And then I got the sample, and I'm like, oh my God, I got to get this. And you've been a part of my life, even though this is the first time we've actually seen each other and spoken together. But you've been a big part of my life for many
Oh,
years, and I really greatly appreciate that. And then again, I'm tickled pink because I get to talk with you and we get to have some time together.
thank you so much, Craig. And I feel like I know you because we have interacted on social media on and off for years. And I'm so honored that, you've been so thoughtful about sharing your experience of my work. And, that's why I do it. So that's the best thing that I can hear is that something's been helpful. So thank you for
Well,
sharing that.
you are quite welcome, and thank you. And that brings me to the next topic. I always like to ask my guests, what brought you to this place? What prompted you, if you're willing, whatever
Yeah,
you're
of
willing to
course.
share, to this helper field? I mean, we need helpers in the world, and you're a magnificent helper.
Oh, thank
What
you.
jazzed you? What got you here?
Well, it's funny because, when I was thinking about, all right, well, what brought me here? It's like it's like all the same tree, right? The tree of one's life, but there are
Mhm.
different branches off of that tree. And, one would be the psychology tree. And I think, honestly, even as a young child, I was very interested in what made people tick and why they did the things they did. And could we change certain things?
Mhm.
Just a very quick aside, a lot of my work started in the health psychology field, even though the other stuff we'll get to, the more kind of transpersonal and paranormal stuff was always a thread there as well.
Mhm.
But the health psychology thing was, I grew up in a family where, our extended family was really part of our family. So I knew people who were like second cousins and beyond as if they were immediate family in some cases. But many, many people were really ill.
Mm.
And, there was this time early in my life, I was probably 23, and I think there were like 8 people died in like 10 weeks of
Oh,
different things. And,
yeah.
you know, I was an anxious kid. My own anxiety was very spiked by this, my own
Yeah.
kind of existential anxiety, and so, I wanted to understand that better, and I wanted to understand what we could change about our physical and emotional well-being, so that things didn't have to seem so fated. Um, and in terms of the hypnosis and the guided imagery piece, in the 80s when I was a teenager, my parents would take us to this Chinese restaurant in a strip mall. You could say, "Where the heck is this interview going?" But they didn't take reservations, and we would go there pretty frequently. And so you often had to wait. It was pretty popular. And next door, there was this bookstore. And right in the front of the bookstore, there was this carousel with all of these audio tapes at the time on self hypnosis and guided imagery. And so I was listening to them to help me
Mhm.
sleep, to help me kind of do more of the things I really wanted to be doing, but felt too anxious to do, and so forth. And they were really powerful.
Mhm.
And that was really encouraging. So my career is kind of dovetailed to incorporate psychology, the kind of hypnosis and guided imagery piece, the health piece, and also the kind of transpersonal piece. And that's something that didn't really exist as a combination when I was earlier in my training.
Yeah.
Um, so I feel very fortunate to have just been able to kind of bring all those things together.
That's amazing. Well, I mean, I certainly understand the anxiety part of it, as a young man. I kind of marvel that I'm sitting here doing podcasts because, uh, I've had experiences where people who are really good at speaking and quickly and moving their thoughts along, in words, in living words, and I'm like 3 layers back. I remember a time I was,
We all feel that way, by the way, or most of us. So
yeah,
myself included.
yeah, I remember a time I was nominated for academic decathlon in high school, and my 2 good buddies, Guy was on the left side, and Bud was on. He's now known as Clyde. That's the story in and of itself. But they're on either side of me, and they're asking us questions and everything. And the 2 of them were just going back and forth and everything, and I'm just sitting there going, "Well, I don't, trying to get a word in edgewise. So, but guided imagery has been helpful for me greatly. And to have helpers like you, while we're not in the room together and everything, but being able to listen and know just automatically that, whether you know me or not, you get me, right? Because the stuff that you present catches me and captures me. I really appreciate that. So,
thank you.
And Andrew, in his intro, talked about unpacking possibilities, and I would like to talk a little bit about that. But I also Curious Explorers is a new podcast.
Yes,
and all of it captures my interest. But I've been watching the late night, Curious Explorers. And by the way, the little girl voice at the beginning, that gives me the willies.
That's the idea. I know that the paranormal is real. That was the perfect intro music to find for that podcast.
Yeah.
Which is very centered around mysteries and historical stuff, but the paranormal is a very prominent thread. Whereas unpacking possibility, that transpersonal or paranormal element can creep in there, but it's really more about, people who've done things that we all want to do and kind of their aha moments and how we can use what they've learned and what they share to kind of become more of the people we would really like to see ourselves being, to realize more of what we actually have inside of us, that potential.
Yeah, that's wonderful. How did you connect with Kathy Kelly? The Kathy
A. Kelly. So Kathy and I met, I'm going to say it's got to be like 15 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
We used to have a home like in the next town over from Kathy's store in Asbury Park. And it's the Paranormal Bookstore and the Paranormal Tower, the Paranormal Museum, which is actually very well known. It's definitely a destination for people. And I've always been interested in the paranormal. That's another story in and of itself. And so I would go in there and we would just chat and we became good friends. And, we would talk about various, famous cases or whatever, or just kind of, shoot the breeze about all kinds of weird stuff. And if you listen to the podcast, you'll see everything from, remote viewing, or which is not really Kathy's thing, or we had an episode on retro causality, which will tie into your spooky action at a distance in a minute.
I watched that last night.
That's actually still one of my favorite episodes. I think we've got 10 episodes now. But we would talk about these different things. Kathy is actually a trained historian, and so she always brings a different perspective.
Yeah.
And it's just a place. It's a venue, or it's the store itself for you to just kind of explore all kinds of things that normally don't get explored or talked about in normal daily life.
Right.
And the podcast was a way for us to kind of take that to the wider world.
It's wonderful. And, one of the first episodes, she was talking about Abraham Lincoln, and you and I have talked about or chatted about this. And I was a big Abraham Lincoln buff as a kid, and I learned a poem. My brother, this was not known as ADHD or now it's not called Asperger's, it's under the spectrum, but boy, he fit the mold perfectly, and raising his hand or not raising his hand. And, the teacher's always trying to, what are we going to do with David? So they would give him extra work. And one of the things that they gave him was a list of poems to learn and recite. And, I was like maybe 5 years old, and we were in Philadelphia at the time, South Philly, and my grandmother Machera, she was big on education. She didn't have an education, and she felt like education was the key. Grew up in the Depression and whatnot, and she was a seamstress, and so I was a little sneak. I was always, she would go to the market every day to get things and prepare the meal and whatnot. And she'd go buy what they called the 5 and dime. And I wanted toys, right? So I used to tell her, Grandma, if I tell you a poem, would you get me a toy? So I mean, she'd make me recite the poem, and this is the one that of Abraham Lincoln, that was an obscure poem. I can't find it. I can only remember snippets of it, but and you generously mentioned it to Kathy because she's a historian and she's a big Lincoln buff, and I figured if anybody could find the poem, it would be her, right?
And she wasn't aware of it, but who knows? Knowing Kathy, she might be searching as we speak.
Well, it was such a treat that you sent me that picture of her with Abraham Lincoln and the lock of his hair, and that was just wow. Brought back so many memories.
Yeah, just to clarify, Kathy wasn't actually with the Abraham Lincoln, but with the piece of the flag. She has this framed photo in the store, and there's this piece of the flag that draped his coffin, this little tiny piece, and I think it's a lock of his hair. So yes, but if she could go back in time, which maybe she could, she would actually want to meet Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah, I totally am a kindred spirit with her on that. And and speaking of kindred spirits and intuition and whatnot, I know that's something that you have a lot of experience with, and I like to weave in how the brain works and whatnot.
Okay.
Guided imagery and hypnosis and intuition. I mean, can you give us a little bit on that?
Okay, I'm going to try and find a good and concise thread. That's not my strong point, but I'm going to do my best.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah. So, something that I think intuition practice and guided imagery and hypnosis have in common is this change in awareness. So, and change in focus. So, hypnosis, kind of by definition, is a state of enhanced focus on something specific and attention to that and absorption in it, and decreased attention to absorption and focus on everything else.
Mm-hmm.
And guided imagery similarly does that, right? Because we're listening to this guided imaginal journey, whether it's into a nature scene or into an experience of our future self achieving and doing the things we really want to do in a very multi-sensory way.
Mm-hmm.
But that kind of automatically brings us to a very inner focused state, a more, one where we're very absorbed in that image. And to be honest, I think that sometimes it's hard to distinguish between guided imagery, which is by definition hypnotic, and what clinical hypnosis often looks like.
Mm-hmm.
That said, you can be in a trance state without any sort of imagery. So I guess maybe that's a distinction. But what happens is, parts of our brain that normally are focused on paying attention to everything, including assessing how we're doing, this kind of salience network. I'm not a neuroscientist, but this is kind of a basic kind of description that kind of quiets down, right? So we're not in the state of self-consciousness when we are focusing on whether it's mental rehearsal, achieving a goal, decreasing pain, or chemotherapy-induced nausea, whatever it is, because hypnosis is useful for so many things. If you want to quit smoking, maybe it's the vision of you having clear lungs and smelling fresh and going through your day, making different behavioral choices other than smoking and so forth.
Right.
So, the intuition piece is that, one, guided imagery and hypnosis are very useful for practicing intuition, both feeling that you can do it and moving forward in time to when you are more intuitive and it feels very normal, just like you use all of your other senses. But also helping you pay attention to the more subtle kinds of perceptions that are usually what we pick up on when we're intuitive in daily life. Now, some of them can be quite dramatic and loud, but not all of them are. And I'll stop there for a second and, let me know where else you'd like to go?
Well, no, I think this is fascinating. So I've got your clairaudience audio, which I love,
Thank you.
and I'm learning so much from it. But yesterday, I mean, it was, a busy day, and I was wanting to make sure that I had the show prep done, and I had to do the job that pays the bills, and so on and so forth. And you have a track in there for sleep, clairaudience, enhancing it while you sleep. So I thought, well, hey, let me listen to this, and I lay down. I lay down on the floor, on the dog bed, with my feet propped up, right? Okay, crazy Craig, there's something that you probably didn't
We've
need.
all done
I
it.
didn't.
We've all done it. We all have
And
dogs.
yeah, and I was listening, and I was feeling like I can't get relaxed, and then the next thing you know, I wake up, and I mean, it just brought me to that place of sleep. And then, just learning through what you're talking about in there, I talk to myself a lot. I hear lyrics, or I imagine that I, hear lyrics, and, the song that's in particular that I've been, hearing in my mind is one called Over the Waterfall by Emily McGuire, who's an independent singer-songwriter out of the UK. And it's about her bipolar journey, which touches me because, my mother had bipolar disorder. And, there's another story on how I met Emily, but it's just a gorgeous song. And I'm thinking, why is that song in my head right now? I wasn't thinking about mom. I wasn't, and so you started this, it's starting to cook in my head, that, okay, I can develop this clairaudience. I'm already doing it, to a certain extent, and understanding better about it. And I think that's, one of the things that has been so important for me in my journey, and listening to you and others, but in particular you, is, there's a science behind this. You just don't come up with, an audio. I mean, there's, I'm sure that there's research, and you're weaving in these themes that are so important. Like I said, here's the clairaudience for sleep, and I didn't think I could sleep, and boom, I'm out.
Well, first I want to say that, I think you're right that if you are somebody who tends to, notice your own self-talk
Mm-hmm.
and hear, music very vividly in your mind, when you imagine things or engage in guided imagery, there's a notable auditory component to that. I actually don't think it's a huge leap to tapping into intuitive information that might come through in an auditory way. And, just so you know, it's like for most people, for me, for most people, it's not like walking around all day and being bombarded by intuitive information. I mean, that would be honestly crazy making, I think, for people.
Mm-hmm.
Um, just like you wouldn't leave your front door open for anybody to come in, but you would choose selectively when you want to let guests in or, somebody else. That's, I think our minds naturally have that kind of gate.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the training is also to learn when to open it more thoughtfully and when to close it. But in terms of the science for the albums, like with HemiSync or Hay House, the whole Health Journeys audio catalog now is with Hay House.
Right.
And I have an intuition album and a manifesting album with them. And then I just did 3 for HemiSync. And just as an aside, you are somebody who is an expert at brainwave entrainment. And what I really like about HemiSync is they incorporate that.
Yeah.
Their
It's a
work,
powerful tool.
yeah,
Combination.
absolutely. Their work over the years has shown that that can help people get into a more not only hypnotically receptive state, but a more intuitively receptive state.
Mm-hmm.
I incorporate hypnotic suggestion, guided imagery, mindfulness kind of theme suggestions because those do help us to tune out external noise
Mm-hmm.
and open us up to kind of tuning into other types of perceptual experiences. when you asked, when I heard the the intro and spooky action at a distance, I thought,
Yes.
oh man, I got to brush up on this because I'm not a physicist. But it was a good reminder to kind of take a look at that again, because I think that whole quantum mechanic kind of explanation, or that entanglement explanation, doesn't only apply to particles, right? But it applies to how psychic phenomena might be or is possible. So I'm going to give my very basic description of that. Einstein and Schrodinger theorized that particles could be entangled. So two particles at great distances could be, they weren't independent of each other. And so what you would do to affect one particle would instantaneously affect the other particle, and faster than the speed of light. And this was kind of a heretical thing to talk about in the 1930s, and even now there are people who are like, oh, that doesn't make sense to me. But it's since been proven in laboratory experiments that things at great distances can instantly be one affecting the other. And the entanglement, I think, helps explain how you can tap into what's going on with a person or an event, regardless of distance in space or time. Something in the future, something in the past, something going on concurrently but far away. And I think it also explains how we can manifest, right? Tap into a future possible self and make it more probable. And how even things like distance healing can work, not only across a physical distance, but again, across time. So, there are lots of other people who could explain that much better than I just did. And I've had the pleasure of interviewing some of them, and we can talk about their work at any point.
Yeah.
But so when you think about it that way, it doesn't seem like there's like, Dean Radin refers to it as like the woo-woo taboo. So in other words, like a real scientist wouldn't talk about these things. It's like this big taboo about talking about these woo-woo things. But, there's actually quite a bit of evidence that these phenomena are real and in many cases repeatable, although they often happen outside of the laboratory in more dramatic ways. But the guided imagery, I really think, just takes our consciousness and gives it a direction, and maybe we are entangled with other types of information, other versions of ourselves. And so what we do in the now then would have an impact. Anyway, it's a very long kind of tangent there, but
no, it's a good tangent. I'm sitting up, you should have seen, you probably, when we do the replay or whatever, you'll see me standing at attention, kind of as you started to speak about that. And, I go back to, I started to, well, I've always been kind of interested, even as a young man in the paranormal, but I didn't call it the paranormal. And then, I read Bell Ruth's The Sixth Sense, and there's a lot of heart-based, heart-centered action in that, and I picked up on that. I don't have my beads on now. I took them off, to put my lucky podcast shirt on. This is from my he's passed, my dear friend Peter. So I always wear this in honor of him.
Oh, you're entangled. Still.
Yes, very entangled. And so
truly, though.
Exactly. And I put my beads, my Dharma beads, on my heart, and I imagine breathing through it and everything. And I feel like that helps me get connected. Like I talk about I talked about, the song lyrics to Over the Waterfall that has been stuck in my head. Well, that's my very dear friend. I've talked to her a couple of times. She's in the UK, I'm here, but her music has always captured me. And she's going, through, and this is an open, I'm not giving anything personal away. I mean, she's very honest and open about her her journey with bipolar disorder, and she's having a rough time. She's had a very difficult time, and I just feel a connection to her. And I'm not trying to think of Over the Waterfall; it just comes in my head. And so there's my layman's Luddite take.
I mean, maybe you'll hear from her today, or maybe something else will come up that will make that, make sense on yet another level. And sometimes no, and sometimes we don't know till later. But
Right.
I don't know if you found this, but I also find that certain things have become both the actual thing in my mind, but also like a symbolic kind of shorthand.
Yeah.
So where
That
certain
makes
songs
sense.
or certain people or certain, experiences that pop into my mind, it's like, oh, okay, pay attention. This is coming. Or, oh,
Yeah.
this is how I can understand this.
Have you always been somewhat intuitive in your life journey? I mean, is that something that's always been a thread for you?
Yeah. And just as a disclaimer, I don't want people to think that I'm not Teresa Caputo going into a restaurant reading everybody, nor should I be. That is not my
Right.
life path. And great that she can do that. But no, I've had what I would say are psychic, intuitive experiences, paranormal experiences, which are for me a little bit different, even though they could all be under the same heading, and transpersonal, which to me there's like some elevated kind of quality to it, but since early childhood. And for a long time that was very disconcerting. And it was a lot of kind of random stuff. Some stuff was important for me to know, and some stuff just seemed kind of like, psychic noise, almost like
Yeah.
just like stuff you pick up. And when I started working in integrative medicine, like I'm going to say like 20-ish years ago now, it was like the first time I was working with a small group of people where we could talk about those things openly. And I started going to the Association for Research and Enlightenment, the Edgar Casey ARE, which was,
Oh yeah.
they
Yeah.
used to
Yeah.
have a physical space in Manhattan, and unfortunately that's since closed. But I wound up taking a bunch of classes and trainings there. And honestly, at that point, it was to kind of like tamp down or feel like I had some control. And what I realized was that actually anyone can go into a setting like that, and in the first hour tune into very accurately a person they've never met and pick up on things that would not in any way be obvious from the silent person sitting across from you. And all that is to say that this is a very trainable skill, but it's, I think, a latent ability in most people. It's a somewhat active ability in other people. I think a lot of times we use language in our society to make sure to de-woo-woo things. It's the first time I've ever said that. But,
I like that.
But like make it so that, like I had a supervisor once, I was trying to kind of describe what was happening in a session with a patient, and I was a trainee, and I didn't get there yet because right away, and I think this was psychic on his part, he would deny it, but he said, by the way, blah, 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 none of that's psychic. But he would talk about clinical intuition. And I remember thinking, like, well, what does he think that is? It's more than just what we're picking up consciously and subconsciously. But we're so trained to devalue or dismiss. But some of the best doctors, therapists, scientists, artists, people, mechanics, people in every walk of life, I think tend to be people who notice their intuitive guidance in some way, and it helps them solve problems faster. It helps them to be more creative. So, the training actually, I think it is as important to know how to kind of have good boundaries around when we tune in and when we don't. but
Mhm.
we can also tune in a way that is a little more deliberate and accurate, and just allow that to be a part of our daily lives.
That, that's fantastic. Yeah, I appreciate hearing you say that. Um, remote viewing, if I can.
Yeah, of
I
course.
watched the podcast that you had with Lynn Buchanan,
Yeah, yeah.
and I got the Audible book, The Seventh Sense.
It's
So
such a good book. It's such a
yeah.
good book.
How did you connect with him, and how's that uh, journey, so to speak?
I'll try and condense it, but a million years ago, I read Psychic Warrior by David Morehouse.
Mm,
David was one of the original remote viewers. So for people who aren't familiar, from about 1972 to about 92, 93-ish,
hmm
the federal government funded on an annual basis this psychic spying program. I mean, that's pretty much what it was.
Right.
The Russians had been doing it. This was a program that was deliberately kind of, I don't know that it was ever officially secret, but it certainly wasn't publicized. But every
hmm
year they had to go before Congress and lobby for their $1,000,000, which in the federal government actually isn't a lot of money.
No.
But back then, for something like this, it wasn't nothing. And basically, Lynn was also one of the original remote viewers. And they actually were pretty successful, despite the kind of CIA disinformation when they closed the program. It
Right.
wouldn't have been funded every year had it yielded nothing. But fast forward, I wanted to study remote viewing. I don't even I think I might have read Lynn's book, The Seventh Sense, and I wound up studying initially with Pam Coronado, who's a well-known psychic detective. She's had a bunch of TV shows. She's been around forever, and she's excellent. She's worked with law enforcement. That's a tool she uses. It's not the only tool she uses. And then I studied with Lori Williams, who was one of Lynn's students back in the day. I would say
hmm
one of, the more well-known and an incredible remote viewer. So I studied for a few years with Lori, and then I wound up studying with Lynn.
Mm.
Um, there are amazing remote viewers. I almost hesitate to call myself a remote viewer. I would rather say like I'm somebody who's studied and it currently still studies remote viewing, but there are people who are like practicing every day that, if there's a missing person, you want them on it.
hmm
Those are the people I feel more comfortable saying, "Oh, that's a remote viewer."
Right.
But it's
Right.
very systematic discipline. Lynn likens it to a martial art, but it is very structured. And that is very different from the way that I was trained when I was at the ARE, which is really more kind of sitting and tuning in, which feels more natural and comfortable for me.
Right.
It requires a lot more discipline to do remote viewing, but there is nothing in the universe that is not knowable to someone. Doesn't mean everybody's going to know everything, but I mean, what they found is you really cannot necessarily conceal something. People who have something to hide should just forget it,
Right.
because if somebody wants to know it, they will. Not to scare anybody.
Thank
But
goodness I'm an open book, huh?
one of the other things that they found, though, is that you cannot view a target without affecting the target in some way.
Mm.
And you cannot, and the target just being the thing you want to know more about. And you cannot view a target without taking a little bit of it with you, which is something to
Mm.
be really careful about. And so the discipline has kind of built in safeguards to help you not, and sometimes you do anyway, but not walk around with stuff that you don't want, because a lot of people who do remote viewing back in the day and now still, especially those who work with like law enforcement, the things you're picking up on, you don't want to take with you, and not everybody's cut out for that.
Right.
I know that I am not cut out for that sort of thing. Pam Coronado, by the way, is amazing because she can tune into things that like you'd lose sleep over for months.
Wow.
And she just has a system for compartmentalizing, that's amazing.
It's funny. That's the word I was thinking, compartmentalizing. I have my own experience with compartmentalizing things,
It's
story for
adaptive.
another time. Yeah, exactly.
We need defenses.
Exactly. So, we're coming up on 40 minutes, and Andrew always told me, keep it about 40 minutes, but I'm like, well, but 40 is not enough.
Happy
So
to come back anytime.
that's where I was leading to. But, real briefly, what's you have so much on your plate. What's the top stuff that you're really, diving into or focusing on right now?
So, as you know, I had I'm going to tell you why I'm saying this, a disabled dog. And for 3.5
Yeah.
years, 24/7, that was my big priority. So kind of
Yeah.
all the other stuff kind of necessarily had to move to the side. Loretta was a
Right.
24/7. She was like having a toddler
Oh,
attached to you. But I love her still, and she was worth it. But now
right.
that I'm suddenly kind of faced with a more normal potential schedule, I do want to start recording more
Hmm.
hypnotic imagery. I'm really enjoying the podcast, and I want to devote more to those.
Yeah.
And I
It's
would like,
fun, isn't it?
yeah, and I would like to. I'm in the process of just starting writing a book on everyday trance states and how we can
Oh,
kind of
wow.
utilize those. Um, so, fingers crossed. I'm gonna have to manifest. I'm gonna have to use my entanglement connect to my future self that's completed the task.
Nice. I like that. I
But
like that a lot.
thank you for asking.
Oh, you're welcome. I mean, there's so many things that I would like to be able, you're a busy person. You've got things, but I mean, in future podcast things I'd like to touch on, um, you know, just off the top of my head, just I'm thinking about the intuition. I'm thinking about compartmentalizing things. I have a situation where I really have to kind of compartmentalize some really tough stuff. And I'd like to talk more about how that process works. And, we can put a pin in it. Okay.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
So it's just been an absolute delight. And I'm, taking the time out of your busy schedule to come and chat with me. And, this has been a bucket list thing for me
Oh,
to get to meet and, I mean, maybe someday I'll get back on the East Coast and, I want to go to the museum and whatnot, and interact. And, but it's been an absolute delight for me to have you here. And
likewise. Thank you
I'm
for
looking
having me.
forward to, listening to more podcasts, and maybe we'll get another one. We'll pull one in here, and we're going to stay in the as we stop this. Riverside. We've got to get our local files
Yeah.
uploaded and whatnot, and then what I will be doing, is, taking this and cleaning it up and looking at the transcript and finding little breadcrumb things, and I'm going to upload it to Spotify. And as you know, I put together a LinkedIn article that will be, it was the introduction, then it'll turn into the breadcrumbs, and I'll put some little Easter eggs in there for you if I can find them. And anyway, I'm rambling because I'm just excited.
Oh,
But
that's so sweet. I'm honored, and it was so nice to actually connect in
yeah,
real time.
it is. It is. This is, again, a treat and a delight. So with that, you have a magnificent day
Thank you.
and the rest of the week. And I'm going to get off and get this party started for the breadcrumbs episode.
Thanks so much, Craig. So
All
nice
right.
to see you.
Nice to see you. Nice to talk with you. It's been a
Likewise.
blessing. Bye-bye.
Bye.